not with a new national park, but rather a huge, privately operated nature reserve, a place where, as we first reported last fall, buffalo can roam once again.
In the crisp morning of 2019, hundreds of buffalo thundered across the Blackfeet Reservation in northern Montana, their massive, dark forms cutting through a prairie that hadn't felt the weight of wild bison in over a century. Dust rose like a ghostly curtain as hooves struck the parched earth. This was an ambitious reintroduction. But the thing with such projects is just how unpredictable the results are. Today, we'll dive into the story of how Montana released hundreds of buffalo into tribal land. What happened next defied all expectations. Gone, but not forgotten. The plains of northern Montana stretch wide and empty, broken only by the distant outline of the Rocky Mountains. Here, and just across the border into southern Alberta, Canada, lies the ancestral homeland of the Blackfoot people. This vast landscape once throbbed with life under the hooves of millions of buffalo. To the Blackfoot, the buffalo were far more than food or trade. They were central to culture, spirituality, and survival. But by the late 19th century, that pulse had all but vanished. Across the continent, U.S. and Canadian government forces and commercial hunters drove buffalo to the brink of extinction, stripping indigenous communities of their lifeblood, their sustenance, their very identity. Between 1870 and 1885, an estimated 30 million buffalo roamed North America, only to dwindle to a few hundred survivors by 1889. The Blackfoot, like many other tribes, faced devastating loss. Their food supply disappeared. Sacred rituals could no longer be performed as they had been for centuries. By the early 20th century, the region held no wild buffalo at all. For decades, the absence of these keystone creatures left the land fractured. Where the buffalo once shaped prairies with their grazing, trampling, and wallowing, invasive plants and overgrazed soil took over. Streams ran shallow or dry. Native grasses, adapted over millennia to survive under relentless grazing pressure, vanished. Wildlife that depended on the prairie matrix, such as prairie dogs, ground-nesting birds, and coyotes, receded, leaving a hollowed-out ecosystem and a hollowed-out culture. Efforts to bring the buffalo back began sporadically in the 20th century. Small herds were moved to tribal lands in Montana, but the results were mixed at best. The Dawes Act of 1887, which had fragmented communal tribal lands into individual allotments, had lasting consequences. Land disputes emerged between tribal members and cattle ranchers, and tensions over grazing rights made it difficult for buffalo to roam freely. Small herds, often numbering fewer than a dozen animals, struggled to survive without proper care. Bureaucracy stalled shipments and approvals, and a lack of community engagement meant the initiative rarely gained traction. Herds that were introduced sometimes wandered onto private land or fell prey to disease. Reintroduction was deemed nearly impossible. Still, the Blackfoot people did not give up. The 2019 reintroduction in Montana. In the crisp morning of April 2019, a low rumble echoed across the plains of northern Montana. Hundreds of buffalo stepped onto the tribal lands of the Blackfeet Nation for the first time in more than a century. This wasn't a small, cautious release. It was bold, almost reckless. A herd of over 200 genetically selected buffalo, chosen specifically for their lineage and their connection to the original Blackfoot herds that once shaped these lands, now roaming free again. For decades, scientists and tribal leaders had debated the safest way to bring buffalo back. Smaller herds had failed, trapped in fenced enclosures, stressed and vulnerable to disease. Bureaucracy, land disputes, and mismanaged care had made previous efforts nearly invisible. But this time was different. The approach was radical. Release the herd at scale. Let them move, graze, and behave exactly as nature intended. No micromanaging, no controlling every step. Just the land, the animals, and the people watching history unfold. The story of how those animals were chosen begins years earlier and hundreds of miles north, inside the fenced wilderness of Elk Island National Park. By the early 20th century, only a few hundred plains bison remained in North America. Many surviving herds were quietly hybridized with cattle during the ranching boom of the late 19th century, an attempt to create hardier livestock. The result was a genetic problem that still shadows conservation today. Most modern bison carry small traces of cattle DNA. For tribes seeking to restore culturally and ecologically authentic herds, that contamination mattered deeply. The buffalo returning to Blackfeet lands needed to be as close as possible to the original plains bison that once thundered across the northern Great Plains. Elk Island National Park held one of the most important herds in the world for that purpose. Established in 1906 as a refuge for bison conservation, the park became a genetic ark. Over decades, biologists carefully monitored the herd, conducting blood tests and genomic analyses to identify animals free of cattle introgression. By the dawn of the 21st century, Elk Island's plains bison were recognized as among the most genetically intact on the continent. They also shared historical lineage with animals once roaming the Blackfoot Confederacy's vast territory across southern Alberta and northern Montana. The selection process took years. Veterinarians screened animals for diseases that could threaten livestock or wildlife, including brucellosis, bovine tuberculosis, and chronic wasting concerns. Each animal underwent physical exams, blood testing, and quarantine protocols. Only healthy individuals from strong family lines were chosen. The goal was to build a herd capable of long-term survival, genetic diversity, and natural reproduction without constant human intervention. Tribal leaders worked alongside Canadian and American wildlife agencies, conservation scientists, and the Intertribal Buffalo Council, which has helped restore buffalo to indigenous lands since 1992. Logistics were immense. Transporting hundreds of thousand-pound animals across international boundaries required months of permits, transport planning, and coordination. Specialized trailers were designed to reduce stress during travel. Teams monitored the animals throughout the journey, ensuring hydration, ventilation, and minimal injury. Each step was carefully timed to avoid extreme weather and maximize survival. Earlier reintroduction attempts had relied on small groups of animals, sometimes fewer than 20, confined to limited pasture. These herds struggled. Without enough numbers, they lacked genetic diversity and natural herd behavior. Without room to roam, they couldn't shape the landscape the way bison evolved to do. Without community involvement, the projects lacked long-term support. Scientists and tribal leaders realized something critical. Buffalo restoration only works at scale. A handful of animals cannot rebuild a prairie. A functioning herd can. By the time the trailers rolled toward Montana in 2019, the release represented decades of learning. This was no longer a cautious experiment. It was a deliberate leap of faith backed by science and tradition. More than 200 animals meant complex social structures could form immediately. Dominant bulls could establish hierarchies. Cow-calf groups could bond. Seasonal migrations across the reservation could begin naturally. Instead of forcing the herd into artificial patterns, the project trusted the instincts shaped by thousands of years of evolution. From the first hour, the impact was immediate and undeniable. The buffalo didn't graze selectively like cattle. They didn't avoid shrubs or tread lightly. They were indiscriminate, trampling invasive plants, uprooting stubborn shrubs, and grazing across every available patch of prairie. Within days, the landscape began to change. The most dramatic transformation came in places that had long been barren. Wallows, the buffalo's natural depressions formed when they rolled in the dirt to cool themselves or remove pests, appeared across the landscape like miniature lakes carved into the earth. Each wallow, roughly 10 feet across and 2 feet deep, became a natural water catchment. Rainwater pooled in these depressions, seeping into the soil and giving long-dormant seeds their first chance to sprout in decades. Prairie grasses, such as blue grama, buffalo grass, and side oats grama, emerged in startling numbers, some species not seen here for more than 100 years. The buffalo's dung itself became a factor. Each bison produces roughly 50 pounds of dung per day, meaning this herd deposited over 10,000 pounds of nutrient-rich fertilizer daily across the tribal lands. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium seeped into the soil, feeding roots and replenishing what decades of overgrazing and erosion had stripped away. Scientists monitoring soil samples were stunned. Organic matter increased sharply, and soil structure shifted almost overnight. Compaction decreased, porosity improved, and water retention surged, creating conditions that had seemed impossible just weeks before. The grazing rewrote the land's architecture. Shrubs that had dominated the prairie for decades were trampled into submission, and invasive plant species struggled to recover. The buffalo's constant movement broke up the hard, compacted soil left behind by cattle, exposing seeds that had lain dormant for over a century. Native plants exploded across the landscape. In some areas, vegetation cover surged from bare patches to over 60% green coverage within a single growing season. Satellite imagery captured the change, showing swaths of the Montana plains greening dramatically in ways researchers had only dreamed of. This resurgence went deeper than the surface. The soil itself began to breathe again. Water, which once ran off quickly across hardened ground, now soaks in, filling shallow aquifers and nourishing young grass shoots. Each wallow acted like a micro-reservoir, retaining moisture long after the rains had stopped. By the end of the first year, areas once dominated by invasive species were now dotted with native grasses, wildflowers, and flowering shrubs. But the transformation did not end here. Cascading biodiversity effects. The prairie had only just begun to show the first signs of green when the ripple effects of the buffalo's return became impossible to ignore. They reshaped the habitat, setting the stage for a cascade of wildlife responses. Coyotes were among the earliest responders. These adaptable, mid-sized predators had never fully disappeared from northern Montana, but the healthier, more diverse prairie created by buffalo grazing gave them new opportunities. Grazing creates a patchwork of tall and short grasses, revealing small mammals like voles, mice, and ground squirrels. The predators adjust their hunting behavior accordingly, focusing on areas where prey is more exposed. Where once dense, uniform grass made hunting unpredictable, the bison-created mosaic allowed coyotes to exploit new corridors efficiently. Above the grass, raptors found new abundance. Golden eagles, which historically range across the northern Great Plains, now had clear sightlines across rolling prairie and an influx of prey. Carrion from natural bison calf mortality, which is usually between 8 and 12% for wild herds, provided an additional, predictable food source. Eagles, ravens, and other scavengers adjusted their foraging strategies to capitalize on these temporary but nutrient-rich resources, often converging on areas where calves had fallen or where buffalo had wallowed and disturbed the soil, exposing small vertebrates. These behavioral adjustments allow raptors to increase their hunting efficiency and breeding success without human intervention. Even apex predators began to respond. Mountain lions, which require large territories and stable prey populations, were observed moving more frequently into the foothills and prairie edges. All of this happened within a few years of the buffalo's reintroduction. Their hunting behavior is tied directly to the availability of herbivores, with bison re-establishing a patchwork of grass heights, and with smaller prey like deer and rodents thriving. Mountain lions could patrol predictable hunting grounds while conserving energy. Beneath the predators, smaller mammals adjusted their behavior to the dynamic environment the bison created. Prairie dogs and ground squirrels, once suppressed by agriculture and overhunting, found the mixed-height grasses ideal for establishing burrows. These animals instinctively dig near grazing corridors to maximize access to nutritious shoots, and in turn, their burrowing aerates the soil, improves water infiltration, and supports the growth of flowering plants that attract insects. Rabbits and voles exploit the newly created vegetation gaps while staying close to burrow networks for safety. Their population movements are closely tied to the spatial grazing patterns of the bison, which continuously shift vegetation heights and density across the prairie. Then there were the wallows. As bison rolled in dirt and mud to shed winter coats and scratch itches, they left depressions that naturally filled with rainwater. Amphibians, such as western toads and leopard frogs, immediately adopted these temporary pools for breeding. Reptiles, including garter snakes and horned lizards, adjusted their thermoregulation and foraging behaviors to take advantage of the newly shaded, moist, and structurally complex areas around wallows. Many small mammals also use these depressions for hiding or as foraging spots. Insects and pollinators responded rapidly to the behavioral modifications imposed by the bison. Grazing opens space for flowering plants, while dung from each bison, averaging 50 pounds per day, acts as both fertilizer and a nursery for detritivores. Native bees, butterflies, beetles, and other pollinators adjusted their flight paths and foraging patterns to exploit the expanding floral resources. Birds and small mammals adapted as well. They followed insect abundance for food and nesting material. This behavior-driven network forms a tightly linked trophic cascade. Herbivore movement shapes plant distribution. Plant distribution influences prey availability. Prey availability governs predator behavior, and the cycle reinforces itself. Even scavengers like black vultures and ravens displayed behavioral flexibility. With predictable sources of carrion from natural bison mortality, they adjusted roosting and flight patterns to maximize access while avoiding competition. Ground nesting birds such as meadowlarks and sparrows, which require varied vegetation heights, adapted their nesting and foraging strategies to exploit areas recently grazed by bison. In each case, the bison's presence, through grazing, trampling, and wallowing, acted as a behavioral cue for wildlife, prompting shifts that restored ecological function, hydrological, and fire regime benefits. The first rains of the Montana spring fell gently, yet their impact was nothing short of miraculous. Where once water ran off the hardened prairie almost as soon as it hit the ground, ephemeral streams now lingered in some regions. Groundwater monitoring wells revealed that the water tables had risen within the first 2 years of the buffalo reintroduction. Scientists had predicted a decline, expecting thousands of large herbivores to draw water faster than the soil could retain it. Instead, the land was holding water like never before. You see, each wallow is a miniature reservoir. When rain fell, water pooled in these depressions, seeping slowly into the soil. Combined with the dense cover of vegetation the buffalo had encouraged and the nutrient-rich soil patches created by dung, evaporation decreased dramatically. Soil organic matter acted like a sponge, holding moisture in a way compacted, overgrazed soil never could. Seeds that had waited for decades found the moisture and nutrients they needed to germinate, and native grasses sprouted with remarkable speed. Within months, the transformation was visible across the Blackfeet Reservation. Streams that once flowed only for hours after rain now ran for weeks. Small depressions held temporary pools, becoming lifelines for amphibians, insects, and small mammals. Satellite imagery confirmed the greening of thousands of acres, showing patterns of water retention that researchers had not thought possible. Then came the fire season. Historically, Montana's plains had burned frequently, but now fire behavior was changing in unexpected ways. The dense, continuous cover of grass created by bison grazing burned hot but stayed at ground level. These ground fires eliminated invasive woody plants like mesquite and shrubs that had spread unchecked over the decades, yet they left the deep-rooted prairie grasses untouched. Planned burns, which property managers had used sparingly in the past, now gained a new ally in the buffalo. After fire, the bison instinctively moved to the newly burned areas, drawn to the tender, nutrient-rich shoots of post-fire regrowth. They grazed evenly, preventing any single plant species from dominating and maintaining plant diversity across thousands of acres. In areas where humans had attempted to control vegetation after burns, one or two aggressive species would usually take over. With bison, the regrowth was evenly clipped, nourished, and trampled in ways that mimicked millions of years of natural prairie disturbance. Standing on the plains in late summer, tribal observers and scientists witnessed a land transformed. Shimmering streams traced the contours of newly hydrated soil. Grasslands burned briefly in controlled patches, only to rebound greener and denser under the watchful hooves of hundreds of bison. The air was alive with insects, birds, and small mammals taking advantage of this revitalized mosaic. And at the center of it all, the buffalo moved on the land they helped shape. Carbon sequestration and climate impact. The story wasn't just about the green prairie above ground. Something far more profound was happening beneath the soil. As the native grasses, such as blue grama, buffalo grass, and side oats grama grew, their roots penetrated deeply into compacted, previously degraded soil, drawing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it in organic matter below. Unlike trees, whose carbon is concentrated in woody biomass, grasslands lock most of their carbon underground. Every year, as shoots die back and roots turn over, a cycle of growth, decay, and regrowth deposits carbon-rich organic matter deep in the soil. Core samples taken across multiple plots on the Blackfeet Reservation revealed that within the first 2 years, soil carbon in the top 12 inches increased by roughly 40%. Across the full 150,000-acre site, researchers estimated this translated to about 75,000 tons of carbon dioxide captured annually. This is roughly equivalent to taking 16,000 cars off the road. You see, carbon capture in this system isn't just passive. It's the product of behavior, biology, and soil physics working together. Each bison produces around 50 pounds of nutrient-rich dung daily. These dung deposits act as hotspots for microbial activity, decomposing plant matter, and further stabilizing carbon in the soil. The herd's movement patterns, the wandering, grazing, and wallowing, are just as critical. When bison wallow, they create shallow depressions that loosen the soil, improve aeration, and allow water to infiltrate more deeply. Trampling distributes organic matter and seeds across the landscape, creating a patchwork of plant communities that ensures continuous ground cover, preventing erosion and maintaining photosynthetic activity across thousands of acres. This is where the contrast with domestic cattle becomes important. Cattle tend to graze selectively and follow predictable paths, leaving some areas overgrazed and others underutilized. Bison, by contrast, roam freely, graze indiscriminately, and disturb the land in a heterogeneous pattern. This random grazing encourages plant diversity, supports multiple species of deep-rooted prairie grasses, and ensures that carbon is distributed evenly throughout the soil. In this way, the return of bison not only restored the species themselves, but also reinstated the ecological processes that historically maintained prairie health. By stabilizing the land with deep-rooted vegetation, carbon remains locked away, and water retention improves. Wallows capture rainfall, grasses retain moisture, and the topsoil is protected from wind and water erosion. All of this contributes to long-term carbon storage because disturbed or degraded soil tends to release stored carbon back into the atmosphere. In the Blackfeet project, this effect was amplified across hundreds of square kilometers, illustrating how even a single keystone herbivore can indirectly influence regional climate resilience. Comparable cases in other prairie and savanna systems reinforce these patterns. Research in the Konza Prairie Biological Station in Kansas, where bison have been reintroduced for decades, shows that plots grazed by bison sequester significantly more soil carbon than ungrazed plots, and that wallows and trampling create microtopographies that enhance moisture retention and nutrient cycling. In the Great Plains, studies consistently demonstrate that the combination of large herbivore grazing, native plant diversity, and natural fire regimes creates one of the most effective terrestrial carbon sinks on the continent. What the Blackfeet project added was a scale rarely seen in the U.S. today. Over 150,000 acres, hundreds of bison, and integration with tribal land stewardship practices. Soil carbon levels are a measure of ecological restoration success. When carbon increases steadily, it indicates that plant productivity is high, soils are healthy, water is cycling effectively, and ecosystem processes are functioning as intended. In Montana, this surge in carbon beneath the prairie confirmed that the buffalo were actively reshaping the land. Their grazing, dung, and wallowing behavior created a feedback loop. Healthier plants, richer soil, greater water retention, and more carbon storage. The system began to function as it had for millennia, long before European settlement disrupted the prairie ecosystem. But there is another angle to the whole thing, a human angle. Why this matters for the Blackfoot people. Long before buffalo were nearly wiped out from the plains, the Siksikaitsitapi, known in English as the Blackfoot Confederacy, spread across vast territories from what is now northern Montana and southern Alberta to the headwaters of the Missouri River. For thousands of years, Blackfoot bands followed the seasonal migrations of the American bison, building a complex, mobile culture organized around the rhythms of the grasslands and the buffalo herds that sustained them. The Blackfoot were among the dominant plains nations, renowned for their horse culture, warfare prowess, and deep spiritual traditions, with the sun dance, or okan, as a central ceremony that drew bands together each summer and reinforced communal bonds and spiritual renewal. The bison was not merely a food source. It was the axis of Blackfoot life. Every part of the animal had purpose and meaning: meat for sustenance, hides for tipis and clothing, sinew for thread, bones for tools and ceremonial objects, and fat for fuel and trade. In Blackfoot cosmology, the buffalo, called Inii or Nitsit, was a gift from the Creator, a sacred provider with spirit and meaning. Rituals and prayers accompanied hunts. Hunters honored the buffalo's spirit before and after kills, giving thanks for the life taken in service of the community. Such practices were deeply woven into the social fabric, reminding all that sustenance came through reciprocity with the land and its creatures. Then, in the mid to late 19th century, everything changed. As European settlers expanded westward, the buffalo herds, once numbering an estimated 30 to 60 million across the continent, were slaughtered at an astonishing rate. By 1900, fewer than 400 wild bison remained in North America, reduced to tiny remnant groups by commercial hunters, hide skinners, and federally encouraged extermination campaigns. None of this was accidental. Government policies and economic incentives encouraged the mass killing of buffalo as a tactic of conquest. Military leaders and civilian authorities understood that by destroying the plains' primary food resource, they would force indigenous peoples into starvation, dependency, and surrender. Entire families and communities faced desperate conditions as the buffalo vanished. For the Blackfoot in Montana, this devastation was only compounded by treaties that ceded land and imposed reservation confinement. The starvation winter of 1883 to 84 was a stark example of these consequences. Nearly 600 Blackfoot people died in Montana due to starvation and disease, a loss that deeply impacted community structures and population numbers. The collapse of the buffalo did more than remove food from the table. It erased the foundation of cultural, spiritual, and economic systems that had sustained Blackfoot society for centuries. Traditional ceremonies, hunting practices, and seasonal movements all revolved around the presence of large roaming herds. As the animals disappeared, so did the ability to teach younger generations through lived experience. The loss was felt not just in stomachs, but in the heart of cultural identity itself. Despite these burdens, the Blackfoot people never relinquished their spiritual connection to the buffalo. Ceremonies like the sun dance endured even through periods of suppression. Oral traditions, medicine bundles, and sacred stories continued to invoke the buffalo as a symbol of life, resilience, and reciprocal relationships with the natural world. Rituals involving buffalo hides, skulls, and offerings reminded successive generations of their ancestral responsibilities to the land and the creatures that nurtured them. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Blackfoot communities began reclaiming parts of what was lost. Conservation efforts, cross-border indigenous treaties, and collaborations with government and non-government partners aimed not just at the biological restoration of bison, but at cultural renewal. In 2014, the Buffalo Treaty, signed by Blackfoot and allied nations in the United States and Canada, outlined a shared commitment to reviving buffalo herds on tribal lands and restoring traditional buffalo ways for future generations. For the Blackfeet Nation in Montana, the return of buffalo after more than a century's absence was a profound act of healing. The reintroduction of buffalo to Blackfoot lands near Chief Mountain, or Ninaistako, in 2023 occurred at a place sacred to the tribe, where traditional ceremonies, prayers, and medicine wheels welcomed the herd home. Tribal members spoke of goosebumps and deep emotional responses as Inii stepped onto the land that once echoed with their thunder. The presence of buffalo today has reinvigorated cultural practices and education. Tribal schools incorporate buffalo ecology and Blackfoot history into their curricula, teaching children not only about the science of grassland ecosystems, but also about the deliberate near extinction of both buffalo and Blackfoot lifeways at the hands of federal policies. Elders share stories of hunts, of ceremonies that once bound bands together, and of the spiritual relations between people and buffalo spirits. Community events like Inani Days, powwows, and ceremonial hunts provide opportunities for cultural transmission, connecting youth with elders in ways that strengthen identity and continuity. You see, one of the most devastating instruments of cultural disruption was the Indian boarding school system. Beginning in the late 1800s and persisting well into the 20th century, the U.S. government, often in partnership with Christian churches, established boarding schools designed to strip indigenous children of their languages, traditions, identities, and spiritual knowledge. Children were removed from their families and communities, sometimes forcibly. Their hair was cut, their clothing replaced, and their native languages forbidden. They were punished for speaking Blackfoot, for practicing ceremony, and for expressing cultural identity. The stated goal of this system was assimilation, to erase indigenous worldviews and replace them with Western Christian norms. Inside these schools, ceremony was strictly forbidden. Elders and parents were barred from participating, and teachings about sacred relationships, including those centered on the buffalo, were actively suppressed. Objects that carried spiritual meaning, such as buffalo hides, skulls, ceremonial pipes, medicine bundles, and other sacred items, were denounced or confiscated. Youth growing up in the boarding schools were often taught that indigenous religion was pagan, backward, or primitive. For many Blackfoot children, this was their first and only exposure to a world that devalued everything their families had taught them about reciprocity with the land and respect for all living beings. Now, the sun dance, which historically involved music, prayer, and personal sacrifice to seek visions and guidance, now incorporates buffalo prayers and acknowledgments of the animal's sacred role in sustaining life. Before hunts or harvests, Blackfoot rituals traditionally included prayers of thanks and offerings, acknowledging the buffalo spirit's sacrifice. Contemporary revivals of these rituals reinforce reciprocity, humility, and respect for all creation, emphasizing that people are part of, not masters over, the living world. This cultural resurgence matters because it counters centuries of disruption. It reconnects communities to ancestral practices, strengthens intergenerational ties, and affirms indigenous sovereignty over land and culture. For many Blackfoot people, seeing buffalo roam freely again is a reminder that identity, resilience, and spiritual life cannot be fully erased by displacement or policy. The Blackfoot people often describe buffalo not as things they once had, but as kin returning home. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.